and welcome. My name is Juliette, and in this video I'm going to be talking about Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy and help you understand a bit more about its background. Recently I recorded myself performing Clair de Lune, so this is a video that's like a reflection to that one, so you can go check that video out first if you like. Link is in the description. So I'm going to go through a bit of the context and the background of this piece, the time and place of when it was written, a bit about the composer Claude Debussy, and then also finish off with my personal experience of learning this piece, what I found challenging and things like that. So let's talk about Debussy first. The word that gets used to describe Debussy's work the most is probably impressionistic, which was a derogatory term back then when Debussy was alive, but now it's not so bad. But I can't explain this without harking back to art, like visual arts. So this is going to be a part art lesson. Okay, so we are traveling to mid to late 19th century. So up until this period, paint needed to be mixed with pigment and water, right? And somewhat didn't have a container, yeah? Come the 19th century, the paint tube, like the tube itself, was invented. This had an impact on paintings because all of a sudden you can paint outside, you can do outside scenes, you can paint nature. But with that comes painting with natural light. If you think of the sun, and then you have the elements, wind and stuff. Now all of a sudden you have light and shadow, and that's moving because of natural elements. So you're trying to capture light and movement in this real life setting. And this is how artists like Monet and Degas and Cézanne came about, because they created this style to try and capture light and shadows and movement, but in one little painting, one snapshot of a real moment in this fleeting life of ours. How they did this was with these little tiny brush strokes that created this flickering effect. They could paint quickly, and then when you look at their work after all this, you can almost squint and see it moving. Like you can understand that, yeah, I can see the light reflecting off the water. I can see the wind moving the leaves because I'm getting this impression of movement and light. So what happens in the art world gets echoed somewhat in the music world. There's a little bit of a delay, but we get there, right? Now, we're still in the late 19th century. So all the artists who were doing this at the time were from France. They were in Paris, more specifically. Paris was undergoing this huge cultural boom at the time. This was a period described as the Belle Epoque period. It was just before World War I. And Paris was having this population growth. It had this arts growth. If you think about architecture as well, Art Nouveau style was coming around. If you think about the metro stations, the entrances to those, these are in the Art Nouveau style. You're having these natural curves that were mimicking nature. This was the Paris that Debussy was living in at the same time. He was hanging out with these artists. He was hanging out with poets as well, more specifically symbolist poets. Now, these guys were creating works that were a reaction to realism. They were trying to create works that gave an impression of a mood, a reflection of the real life, instead of like talking about a subject directly. So all these artists of various media are hanging out together, they're influencing each other, and you can kind of see that impressionistic style being echoed between the art world, the literature world, and then also the music world. As a result, Debussy has been described as a painter in sound. How can you do that with a piano? So the piano is, and I'm pointing over there because that's where my piano is, it's a mini version of an orchestra. It's a one instrument that I can actually portray every instrument in the orchestra in a way. Kind of, like not exactly, but the impression. It has different tones and colours and timbres that we can actually create with the instrument. And that's why it's one of the few instruments that can do so well on its own. There's just so much piano repertoire because it's an instrument that can be solo. Firstly, the piano has a huge range of really high notes and really low notes. It has 88 different keys, so that's 88 different pitches, and not a lot of instruments actually have a huge range like that. The piano is also capable of some really loud sounds and some really soft sounds, like a huge dynamic range. We also have the pedals that we can use our feet to control, and there's 2 pedals doing different things as well. And then obviously we have our fingers, which can control how we touch the key. And let me tell you, there are so many ways you can touch a key. So as the piano was getting developed over the centuries, like for the most part, the piano's as we know it hasn't really changed since its first development. However, it was being continuously refined, and by Debussy's time, it was still being refined. So the piano of the day, you're still trying to take the piano further, see what else you can do with it, how can you change this colouring, and the instrument was also responding to how can we take the instrument to the next level as well, with pedal refinement, with the touch action. So there's lots to consider with this. So Debussy was a student at the Paris Conservatoire when he was studying. However, he did not like the music rules, especially theory. He, for lack of a better word, rebelled against the composition rules that you would have when you're trying to compose music. He would go and do his own thing, and he created this style of music that was so characteristic to him. He would push the instrument further as how we could use it to create this imagery in real life, using the pedal, utilizing these new and somewhat underutilized features of the piano. He would play with modal harmonies, he would play around with block chords that had this dissonances and these huge intervals. He would also name pieces by quite descriptive titles. If you think of Clair de Lune specifically, that translates to moonlight. So this is Paris and this is Debussy. Now let's bring it together back to Clair de Lune. Right, so Clair de Lune is actually part of a bigger piece of work by Debussy called Suite Bergamasque. This was first started to be written in 1890, and then it was first published in 1905. So Clair de Lune is written in that period. Now, even though after all I've said about Debussy's styles and characteristics that we find in his music, which we can find in the Suite Bergamasque, we also hark back to a much older time with this work, the Baroque period. So let's look at the title first. So the Suite Bergamasque is a suite of 4 dances. And this is a nod back to the dance suites of earlier music in the 17th and 18th century. The word Bergamasque itself harks back to 16th century Italy actually, and the region Bergamo. The characteristics of someone from Bergamo are so well known throughout Italy that a series of dances were created to represent this characteristic, as well as a character that we all know, Harlequin. The original Harlequin was from Commedia dell'arte, which was the ancient theatre in Italy. Harlequin was a comic servant. It was this mix of comedy and tragedy all in one character, and because of that, the people loved him. There is no doubt that Debussy would have known of Commedia dell'arte because it was in France at the time. This was really famous in Paris as well. Now, the 4 movements of the suite are the prelude, the minuet, the Clair de Lune, and the pas à pied. The Clair de Lune being number 3. Clair de Lune stands out because it's the only one that has a descriptive name. The other 3 are either dance forms or standard music forms. So even though Debussy was creating his own style that was current and impacted by what was happening in the day, he was also influenced by earlier musicians and artists. Couperin, who was a French early Baroque composer, and we can see that Baroque influence in this suite, as well as a French artist, Watteau, who was creating art that was bridging and taking art from Baroque to Rococo style and using light and movement and creating this artwork that was taking it to a more natural form than what it was in the Baroque period. We can see those influences definitely in this suite. Now, a key feature that features in Clair de Lune are these harmonic thirds that we hear from the gate. We see these harmonic thirds in 3 of the 4 movements of the suite. They are in the prelude, they're in the minuet, and then they're in the Clair de Lune in a much slower tempo. And this sort of ties those movements all together. Okay, the moment we've been waiting for, Clair de Lune, let's zoom in on that movement. Now, you remember when I said Debussy hung out with symbolist poets, right? So one of these poets was Paul Verlaine. So Verlaine wrote a poem called Clair de Lune, and it was one of a set of 24 poems inspired by that Baroque artist again, Watteau. All these connections. This poem was inspiration for a lot of musical composers too, by the way. Now there's a key line in this poem that actually states Clair de Lune in its original French. I'm not even going to try and attempt French. My French, as you can hear probably from my pronunciations of these names, isn't the best as it is, so I'm just going to go with a literal translation in English. This is the line that actually is probably most captured in Clair de Lune by Debussy. with the still moonlight, sad and beautiful. Now let's bring that all together with everything we've gone through so far. So this poem has all this suggestive imagery of something that you can't really grasp. Moonlight. Yes, the moon, but not moonlight, right? You have to see it reflecting off of something else in order to actually see moonlight, don't you? So we have that influence of the Impressionist artists, we're having it in the literature, and now we're seeing it being influenced again in the music. And we're having that contrast between darkness and light, something sad and something beautiful. The contrast between light and dark in Watteau's paintings. The contrast between high and low sounds in the piano. The contrast between something funny and something sad, like in the character Harlequin. And this is what Debussy tries to do and succeeds at doing in his own musical, Clair de Lune. So the form of this piece is ternary. We have a first section, a second section, and then a third section where the first section comes back. As I've already mentioned, the first section starts with these harmonic third intervals, but it starts them off quite slow and not directly on the beat. They fall mostly on weaker beats and weaker points throughout the beats. This creates this unsettled feeling in the meter, and there's so much space between the notes as well because we're at a slow tempo right now. It creates this unsettledness. And if you think of the imagery that this is trying to portray, like moonlight in a cloudy night almost, and the clouds are just sort of like slowly drifting, and then you kind of get a hint of moonlight. So we're just sort of getting this hint of sound, and it's like, oh, there's something there. And it's grabbing your attention, but it's also unsettling because it's not where we want to naturally hear it. This first part of this piece is what Clair de Lune is famous for. So getting this right is so hard. And then the second section of the first section has these block chords, very much Debussy. We have this really low note and then we have these high chords. There is our contrast between high and low sounds, trying to give us that contrast between light and dark. And in some of the chords we have this dissonance which still maintains this ambiguity in the piece and yearning for something coming. Then we get to the second section and we have these 16th notes that just create this movement in the piece and this building up to a climax in this section. Now this piece is in D flat major, however Debussy just plays with the chords and we alternate between major and minor, and it still creates this unsettled feeling because he's playing with the tonality. So Debussy. And then we transpose to the enharmonic key to D flat major, C sharp minor. And this is where we reach this climatic point within this section. Now Debussy uses a few things that pianists can use to actually build and build and build up to a climatic point. Not only have we got the movement of those semiquavers that has just created this push in the second section in contrast to the first section, which was much slower, we also have this 3-note little motif that just rises. It goes da 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 and just keeps going until it reaches this point, which is the highest note. And it's easy to create that building suspension to a top note and then come back down as he does in this section. I'm no singer, by the way, so just don't judge me on that. Let's just stick to piano, but I need to kind of, use your voice to describe some of these things. He takes full advantage of the piano, really. And we also have this expression throughout this section, it's animated, like build it up, like go for it. It's great. So after we've reached this climatic point in this piece, it's the highest note, we have to come back down. And that brings us to the third and final section, which is a repeat but slightly different of the first section. We hear the tune come back in. All the excitement has disappeared and we're back to the calm, still sadness of moonlight. We do have a bit of colouring though, which is really interesting here. We have the C flat that sort of comes in where our ear's not really expecting it because we've already heard the tune, right? We know what it's supposed to sound like, but then he introduces this C flat. Creates this sort of feeling of melancholy. And then in the last few lines, we have that 3-note motif come back, but it's much slower now. And the expression mark here is to die away till the end. So how do we do that in music? We are letting the volume mostly and also the tempo just sort of take us away and just literally let the sound disappear in its own time. It really is quite beautiful, but you do get this whole vibe of happiness tinged with sadness throughout the entire piece, and it really is captured with sound. Now this has been probably one of the most difficult pieces I've ever learned. I would never give Debussy to someone who isn't mature enough to handle all the layers that are going on here. I've been learning piano for 20 plus years and I still found it difficult today. The notes themselves weren't difficult to read and learn, and the pace of the piece isn't, doesn't make the note learning any harder either. It's the control of the touch and the pedal that really do this piece justice. So that's where the efforts, or my efforts at least, needed to go into. One of the hardest things I found with this piece was that first section, the most famous section. I had to work really hard on the rhythm, and I had to work hard on getting those harmonic thirds to sound together. Because there is so much space in this first section, those notes are just exposed. So if you don't sound those two notes in the interval together, I can hear it and it drives me nuts. So I worked so hard at getting those. I actually used some exercises by Czerny that were on thirds to help me get my fingers, playing thirds nicely and sounding together. I must have played those thirds thousands of times, to get them to sound together all the time. Fortunately, they sound lovely, so it wasn't too bad working that hard on them, but man, it took effort. And then the counting, because there is so much space between beats, making sure that they come in on the right beat. I am still struggling with a little bit, and I can hear it in my recording, so be gentle on that if you do listen to it and try and hear out the rhythm. It's not really all there. Something else that was quite hard in this piece is the range of dynamics. The loudest we have is forte, which is loud, and then triple P, which is pianissimo, which is very, very soft for those who aren't familiar with that term. That is hard. Not only is that hard, but playing. So that second section where you have the 16th notes just running, they're all that soft. And it's hard to press a note on the piano softly because it literally contradicts itself. So in order to play a note softly on the piano, you press the note slowly. But in order to play them fast, you need to press a note slowly but fast. So it's quite hard to play soft notes fast. And then Debussy just uses all these soft, fast notes. So that was another struggle, but I think I got that. I think I was quite good at that in the end. Not just playing them soft and fast, but playing them even, because they're just these runs of 16th notes. So they need to still also be consistent, not wobbly. As mentioned, one of the other key features of Debussy's work is the pedal work on the piano. So a lot of attention needs to go into that as well for this piece. With the pedal, you can kind of I call it cleaning. You can clean the pedal and sort of capture some notes but release others, and the amount you push the pedal down can change how many notes you have holding down, right? So being able to control the angle of your foot in order to capture the right notes that you want to capture and release some of the other ones, that was tricky. That was something that I hadn't really ever given that much attention to before this piece, not to this extent anyway. But it really is one of those things that just made this piece. So getting it right and mastering it, when you get that pedal point and you're just the sounds mixed together, just lovely. But it all comes together to create this tonal imagery that we want to capture with Clair de Lune. The moonlight. Something else that I tried with this piece was I actually got some blank manuscript paper and wrote Clair de Lune out by hand onto the manuscript paper. Now I did this because I figured I might notice things that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I was right, I did notice things. A stem going up instead of down, and notice, it actually belongs to this voice. And that's another thing I noticed was actually there was voicing in this piece. I knew that musically, but then to actually sit back and see, okay, there's 3 voices going on and I can see what belongs to what, that was quite insightful too. And then that carried over to how I played the piece as well. The voicing was tricky in some places where when you want a certain note to come out, but you've got 6 playing underneath it, that one on its own can get lost. So you want to be able to balance the notes so that the one you want to hear coming out is, and controlling that across the hands, but not only across the hands, but within the hand, like between fingers as well. That was something I also had to be aware of. And last but not least, there is a lot of baggage with this piece. It's in Ocean's 11, it's in movies, it's been written for orchestral arrangements, even though it's originally only written for the piano. People will probably recognize it, not even knowing its title. It's just such a famous tune. There are just a lot of versions out there, and when you do learn it, you just want to make sure you do the piece justice. When you reach a certain level of, pieces that you're being able to play, you cannot really do the piece justice, in my opinion, without understanding the context of the piece, understanding the background and the time that this piece was written in, understanding your instrument and how you can control that in your touch and music. It all comes together to create what you are creating. And you can really just get into the music and get to that next level of depth that creates the sound that you want it to sound. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you did get something out of this video. If you have any questions on the back of this, please feel free to put them in the comments. And if you have any feedback on what you liked about this video, if you do want more, I'd love to hear about it, because this is the first I've done with this and just trying a few new things. For the most part, this is also a reflection process for me, so that I can look back on this in 30 years and be like, oh yeah, I did that. A lot of the time I forget what I've performed over the years, so having this video record is helpful for me too. But I do feel like it could be helpful for others, so if it is, I would love to hear about it. If you do want more, let me know, and hit that subscribe button so you know when the next one comes out. So thank you again for watching this video, and I shall see you in the next one.